Tonight, we explore a world where your first breath could be your last, where being born meant facing a death sentence from the moment you emerged into the world. In ancient Sparta, newborn babies weren't welcomed with joy and celebration. They were brought before a council of elderly men who would decide whether you deserved to live or die. These old men would examine the baby, searching for any sign of weakness or deformity. If they found even the slightest flaw, that baby would be condemned to death before they could even learn their own name. The children who survived this brutal beginning had no idea of the hell that awaited them. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 480 BCE, and in the rocky hills of Laconia, a woman named Cleomira writhed in labor. But this wasn't a joyful occasion filled with anticipation and hope. This was a terrifying gamble with death itself. Every Spartan woman knew that bringing a child into the world meant subjecting that innocent life to the most brutal judgment imaginable. When the baby finally emerged, a healthy boy with strong lungs and limbs, there was no celebration, no tears of joy, no gentle cooing or soft words of welcome. Instead, the midwife wrapped the infant in a rough cloth and handed him to his father, Alexandros, whose face remained stone cold and emotionless. The father didn't dare to feel love for this child. Not yet. Love was a luxury that could only come after survival. Within hours, Alexandros was walking through the streets of Sparta, carrying his son toward the most feared building in the city, the Lesse, where the Gerousia, the council of elders, would decide his son's fate. These weren't kind grandfathers or wise mentors. These were hardened men who had survived the Spartan system themselves, and they had grown cold and calculating in the process. The building loomed before them, its stone walls seeming to absorb the very light from the sun. Inside, 28 men over the age of 60 sat in a semicircle, their faces weathered by decades of war and hardship. They had done this countless times before. They had looked into the eyes of hundreds of newborns and decided who would live and who would die. To them, this was not murder. This was quality control. Alexandros approached the center of the room and unwrapped his son. The baby, now cold and hungry, began to cry. But the elders showed no emotion. They had heard the cries of the condemned before, and they had learned to ignore them. One by one, they examined the child. They checked his limbs for deformities. They looked for signs of weakness or disease. They measured his proportions and tested his reflexes. The lead elder, a man named Amaratos, whose own scars told stories of battles long past, took the baby in his gnarled hands. He had been doing this for over 20 years, and he had developed an eye for weakness that was almost supernatural. He looked for the things that would make a man unfit for war. A slightly curved spine, a weak cry, eyes that didn't focus properly, limbs that seemed too thin or too short. The examination seemed to last forever. The baby continued to cry, his small voice echoing off the stone walls. His father stood motionless, knowing that any sign of emotion could be seen as weakness, and weakness was not tolerated in Sparta. Even showing love for your own child before it was approved could mark you as unfit. Finally, Demaratos spoke. "The child is acceptable," he said in a voice devoid of warmth. "He will live." But even as he said these words, there was no joy in them. The baby had passed the first test, but it was only the beginning of a lifetime of tests, each one more brutal than the last. Alexandros took his son back, but he still didn't allow himself to feel relief. He knew what lay ahead. He knew that in 7 short years he would have to give this child up again. This time a system that would break him down and rebuild him into something that was barely human. The elders had decided that his son was strong enough to survive, but that survival would come at a cost that most people couldn't imagine. The baby had no name yet. In Sparta, children weren't given names until they had proven their worth. For now, he was simply the child of Alexandros, a temporary designation that could be revoked at any moment if he showed signs of weakness or disease. Names were for those who had earned the right to exist. As they left the Lesha, Alexandros walked past other fathers who weren't so fortunate. In the shadows of the building, he could hear the muffled sobs of men whose children had been condemned. These fathers would never speak their children's names, because their children would never have names. They would never hold them again, because by sunset, those children would be taken to the apothetae, the deposits, and thrown into the chasm to die. The apothetae was a cliff outside the city where the rejected babies were taken. It was a place of horror that the Spartans spoke of only in whispers. The elders claimed it was a mercy, a quick death that spared the children from a life of suffering. But the truth was far more brutal. Many of the babies didn't die immediately from the fall. They lay broken and crying at the bottom of the chasm, slowly dying of exposure and starvation while their parents tried to forget they had ever existed. But Alexandra's son had avoided this fate, at least for now. As they walked home through the streets of Sparta, the father began to plan for the 7 years they would have together. These would be the only years of the child's life that would resemble anything close to a normal childhood. And even those would be marked by constant preparation for the hell that was to come. The house they returned to was sparse and functional. Like everything else in Sparta, there were no toys waiting for the baby, no colorful decorations or soft blankets. Spartan children were raised in conditions of deliberate hardship from the moment they were born. The baby would sleep on a thin mat on the floor. He would be fed simple food and given water instead of wine. He would be exposed to cold and heat to toughen his body for the trials ahead. Cleomira, still weak from childbirth, took her son in her arms for the first time. She had been holding her breath for hours, afraid to bond with a child who might not survive the selection. Now, as she looked into his eyes, she allowed herself to feel a moment of maternal love. But even this love was tinged with sadness, because she knew that in 7 years she would have to give him up forever. The women of Sparta were raised to be as hard as the men. They were taught from childhood that their purpose was to produce strong warriors for the state. They were not allowed to mourn the children who were taken from them. They were not allowed to show weakness or grief. They were expected to celebrate when their sons were chosen for the AGOGE, even though they knew it might be the last time they ever saw them alive. Over the next few days, other families in the neighborhood would learn the fate of their children. Some would celebrate quietly, knowing that their sons had passed the test. Others would disappear for days, unable to face their neighbors after losing a child to the selection. The community was bound together by shared trauma, but that trauma was never discussed openly. It was simply accepted as the price of being Spartan. As the weeks passed, Alexandros began to notice things about his son that filled him with both pride and terror. The boy was strong, with a powerful grip and loud cry. He seemed to have inherited the physical traits that would serve him well in the AGOGE, but he also seemed intelligent, curious about the world around him. This intelligence would be both a blessing and a curse in the years to come. The Spartan system was designed to break intelligent children. It was designed to take boys who might have become philosophers or artists in other societies and turn them into unthinking killing machines. The elders had learned long ago that thinking men were dangerous men, and dangerous men were not reliable soldiers. They needed men who would follow orders without question, who would march into battle without fear, who would die for the state without hesitation. As the months turned into years, Alexandros began to teach his son the basic lessons that every Spartan child needed to know. He taught him to endure pain without crying. He taught him to eat simple food without complaint. He taught him to sleep in uncomfortable conditions without seeking comfort. These lessons were not given out of cruelty, but out of love. The father knew that the more his son could endure at home, the better his chances of survival in the AGOGE. But even as he prepared his son for the trials ahead, Alexandros couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. He watched other children from other societies playing and laughing, and he wondered what his son might have become if he had been born elsewhere. Might he have been a scholar, a merchant, a farmer who lived a simple, peaceful life? These thoughts were dangerous, and Alexandros tried to push them away, but they returned again and again. The boy grew quickly, his body becoming strong and lean. He learned to walk on the rocky terrain around Sparta without stumbling. He learned to ignore hunger and thirst. He learned to control his emotions, to hide fear and pain behind a mask of indifference. By the time he was 5 years old, he was already more disciplined than most adults in other societies. But the child also showed signs of the natural curiosity and creativity that the Spartan system was designed to destroy. He asked questions about the world around him. He showed kindness to animals and younger children. He had a natural sense of justice and fairness that would be systematically beaten out of him in the AGOGE. His father watched these qualities with a mixture of pride and heartbreak, knowing that they would not survive the next phase of his son's life. As the boy's 7th birthday approached, the atmosphere in the household grew tense. Mira began to withdraw emotionally, preparing herself for the separation that was coming. She had seen too many mothers destroyed by the loss of their children, and she was determined not to become one of them. But her detachment was a form of self-preservation, not a lack of love. Alexandros began to prepare his son for what was coming. He told him about the AGOGE, about the training and the hardships he would face. He tried to make it sound like an honor, like something to be proud of. But the boy was intelligent enough to sense the fear and sadness in his father's voice. He began to ask questions that his father couldn't answer. Why did he have to leave? Why couldn't he stay with his family? Why did other children get to play while he had to train? These questions cut through Alexandros like a blade, because he had no good answers. The truth was that the Spartan system was based on cruelty and trauma. But admitting this would be treason. Instead, he told his son that it was their duty, their honor, their privilege to serve the state. He told him that becoming a warrior was the greatest achievement a man could hope for. But even as he spoke these words, he could see the doubt in his son's eyes. The night before his 7th birthday, the boy couldn't sleep. He seemed to sense that something terrible was about to happen. He lay on his mat, staring at the ceiling, asking his father to tell him stories about heroes and battles. But even these stories, meant to comfort and inspire, were filled with violence and death. There were no happy endings in Spartan mythology, only glorious deaths and eternal honor. As dawn broke on the boy's 7th birthday, Alexandros knew that this would be the last day his son would spend as a child. Tomorrow he would begin the process of becoming a weapon, a tool of the state, a creature designed for killing and dying. The transformation would be so complete that the boy who asked questions and showed kindness would effectively cease to exist, replaced by something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous. The selection process had determined that this child was fit to live, but survival and living were two very different things. The boy had passed the first test, but ahead of him lay trials that would test not just his physical strength, but his very humanity. And in ancient Sparta, Humanity was considered a weakness that had to be eliminated. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as 7-year-old Lysander stood beside his father, clutching a small bundle of possessions that represented everything he would be allowed to take from his childhood. Today was the day that every Spartan boy both feared and anticipated. The day he would be taken from his family and handed over to the state. The day his real education would begin. Alexandros looked down at his son, trying to memorize every detail of the boy's face. In a few hours, Lysander would be gone, and when they met again, he would be a different person entirely. The curious, gentle child who had asked endless questions and shown kindness to stray animals would be systematically destroyed and replaced with something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. "Remember what I taught you," Alexandros said, his voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "Show no weakness. Trust no one completely. Survive at any cost." These were the last words of advice he would give his son for years to come, and they carried the weight of a father's love and a warrior's wisdom. Lysander nodded, but his eyes showed the confusion and fear that any 7-year-old would feel when being separated from everything familiar. He had been told that this was an honor, that becoming a warrior was the greatest achievement a Spartan could hope for. But as he looked around at the other boys being gathered for the march to the AGOGE, he saw the same fear reflected in their young faces. The man who came to collect them was named Brasidas, a veteran warrior whose body bore the scars of countless battles. His face was like carved stone, showing no emotion as he surveyed the group of boys who would be placed under his care. To him, these children were not individuals with names and personalities. They were raw material to be shaped into weapons, and he had been breaking boys for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be gentle. "Say your farewells quickly," Brasidas commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never been disobeyed. "You will not see your families again until you have proven yourselves worthy of the title Spartan." The scene that followed was one of barely controlled grief. Fathers embraced their sons with rigid formality, afraid to show too much emotion, lest they be seen as weak. Mothers stood at a distance, their faces masks of stoic acceptance, though their eyes betrayed the pain they were feeling. In any other society, this would have been a scene of tragedy. In Sparta, it was called tradition. One by one, the boys were torn away from their families. Some went quietly, having been prepared for this moment their entire lives. Others cried and clung to their parents, only to be roughly pulled away by Brasidas and his assistants. These displays of emotion were noted and remembered, marking the boys as potential weaknesses to be corrected through harsh discipline. Lysander hugged his father briefly, then walked toward the group of boys without looking back. He had learned early that showing emotion was dangerous, that tears were seen as proof of weakness. But inside, his heart was breaking. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known, everyone he had ever loved, to enter a world where love was considered a liability and kindness was seen as a character flaw. As the group began to march through the streets of Sparta, curious citizens gathered to watch. Some nodded approvingly, seeing this as proof that their society was producing strong warriors. Others looked away, perhaps remembering their own experiences in the AGOGE, thinking of sons and brothers who had not survived the training. The system was so ingrained in Spartan culture that few questioned its necessity, but many carried scars from its implementation. The march to the AGOGE compound took them through the heart of the city, past the temples and public buildings that represented everything they were supposed to die for. The boys walked in silence, their small feet struggling to keep pace with Brasidas's long strides. Those who fell behind were pulled along by the collar, an early lesson in the consequences of weakness. The AGOGE compound stood on the outskirts of the city, a collection of stark stone buildings surrounded by training grounds and obstacle courses. There were no decorations, no comforts, no concessions to the fact that children would be living here. Everything was designed to be functional, efficient, and deliberately uncomfortable. This was not a school in any traditional sense. It was a factory for producing killers. As they approached the entrance, Lysander could see older boys engaged in various training exercises. Some were wrestling, their bodies locked in brutal combat that would have been considered assault in any other context. Others were practicing with weapons, their movements precise and deadly. Still others were running laps around the compound, their faces twisted with exhaustion and pain. What struck Lysander most was the silence. Despite the dozens of boys engaged in various activities, there was virtually no talking, no laughter, no sound, except the grunts of physical exertion and the occasional bark of a command from an instructor. These boys had learned that unnecessary noise was a punishable offense, that every word had to serve a purpose, that casual conversation was a luxury they could not afford. Brasidas led the new arrivals to a courtyard where they were met by other instructors, men whose faces showed the same cold indifference that marked all Spartan educators. These were not teachers in the traditional sense. They were torturers, men whose job was to break down everything that made these boys human and rebuild them as instruments of war. "You are no longer children," Brasidas announced to the group. "You are no longer sons or brothers or individuals with personal desires. You are potential warriors, and whether you become actual warriors depends on your ability to survive what comes next. Many of you will not. Those who fail will be cast out, marked as inferiors for the rest of your lives. Those who succeed will earn the right to call themselves Spartan." The boys were then divided into groups based on their age and physical development. Lysander found himself placed with about 20 other 7-year-olds, all looking equally terrified and confused. They were led to a barracks that would be their home for the next several years. A long, narrow building with nothing but stone floors and wooden benches. Their first lesson was about ownership, or rather the lack of it. They were told that nothing belonged to them anymore. Their clothes, their food, their sleep, their very lives were now the property of the state. They would be given what they needed to survive, but comfort was not considered a necessity. They would sleep on hard floors with minimal covering. They would eat simple food in small quantities. They would own nothing personal, have no privacy, and enjoy no privileges. The sleeping arrangements were deliberately uncomfortable. 20 boys were crowded into a space that would have been cramped for 10 adults. They were given thin blankets that provided little warmth, and they were expected to sleep on rushes that were changed infrequently and provided minimal cushioning. The cold stone floor conducted heat away from their bodies, ensuring that they would be uncomfortable throughout the night. But physical discomfort was only part of the lesson. The boys were also learning about hierarchy and dominance. The older boys, those who had survived several years of training, were given authority over the newer arrivals. They were encouraged to be harsh, to find fault, to punish any sign of weakness or disobedience. This created a system where brutality was normalized and kindness was seen as inappropriate. Food was another tool of control. The boys were fed only once a day, and the portions were deliberately inadequate. They were given black broth, a mixture of blood, vinegar, and salt that was notorious for its terrible taste. They were also given small amounts of cheese and bread, but never enough to satisfy their hunger. The constant hunger was supposed to make them lean and aggressive, to teach them to take what they needed when the opportunity arose. The inadequate food supply had another purpose. It encouraged theft. The boys were expected to steal food from each other, from the kitchens, from wherever they could find it. But if they were caught, they were punished severely. This created a contradictory system where they were encouraged to break rules but punished for being bad at it. The lesson was clear. In war, you must be willing to do whatever it takes to survive. But you must also be skilled enough to avoid consequence. On their first night, several of the younger boys cried quietly into their thin blankets. They were homesick, frightened, and overwhelmed by the harshness of their new reality. But their tears were noticed by the older boys, who had been taught that emotional displays were signs of weakness that needed to be corrected. The crying boys were subjected to additional harassment, physical punishment, and public humiliation. Lysander learned quickly that survival meant adopting a mask of indifference. He had to appear strong even when he felt weak, confident even when he was terrified, emotionless even when his heart was breaking. He watched other boys make the mistake of showing their true feelings, and he saw how quickly they were singled out for punishment. The lesson was clear. Authenticity was dangerous, vulnerability was weakness, and weakness was not tolerated. The daily routine began before dawn with a harsh wake-up call. The boys were given minutes to dress and form ranks, and anyone who moved too slowly was subjected to physical punishment. They were then marched to the training grounds, where they would spend the next 12 to 14 hours engaged in various forms of physical and mental conditioning. The physical training was brutal, beyond imagination. Boys as young as 7 were expected to engage in boxing matches where serious injury was not only possible but encouraged. They were forced to run long distances in minimal clothing, regardless of weather conditions. They were made to carry heavy loads, climb obstacles, and perform exercises that would challenge adult athletes. Those who couldn't keep up were beaten and forced to continue anyway. But the physical training was perhaps the easier part of their education. The psychological conditioning was designed to break down their individual personalities and rebuild them as components of a military machine. They were taught to think of themselves not as individuals but as parts of a unit. They were trained to follow orders without question, to suppress their natural instincts for self-preservation, and to value the group's success over their own lives. The instructors used various techniques to achieve this psychological transformation. They would pit boys against each other in competitions where losing meant punishment for everyone. They would create situations where showing kindness or compassion would result in harm to the group. They would reward brutality and punish mercy, gradually rewiring the boys' moral instincts until cruelty became natural and gentleness became foreign. Sleep deprivation was another tool of control. The boys were kept awake for long periods, then forced to make quick decisions or perform complex tasks while exhausted. This broke down their ability to think clearly and made them more susceptible to conditioning. It also simulated the conditions they would face in actual combat, where they might have to fight effectively after days without rest. The social isolation was perhaps the most damaging aspect of the training. The boys were discouraged from forming close friendships or emotional bonds. They were taught that caring about others made them vulnerable, that loyalty to individuals was less important than loyalty to the state. They were rotated between different groups to prevent them from developing strong relationships, and they were encouraged to report on each other for any sign of weakness or disloyalty. Within weeks, the transformation was already beginning. Boys who had arrived as curious, playful children were becoming harder, more suspicious, more aggressive. They learned to hide their emotions, to suppress their natural empathy, to see violence as a solution to problems. The gentle qualities that marked them as human were being systematically eliminated, replaced by the cold efficiency that the Spartan system demanded. Lysander watched this transformation in himself and others with a mixture of fascination and horror. He could feel his own personality changing, his natural kindness being replaced by calculated indifference. He was learning to see other boys not as potential friends but as competitors or threats. He was developing the ability to inflict pain without feeling guilt, to receive punishment without showing emotion. The most disturbing part was how quickly it all began to feel normal. The constant hunger, the physical pain, the emotional numbness, all of it started to seem like the natural order of things. The boys began to forget what it had felt like to be warm, well-fed and loved. They began to accept that suffering was their lot in life, that comfort was weakness, that the only pleasure they could expect was the grim satisfaction of survival. As the months passed, some boys broke under the pressure. They would have emotional breakdowns, refuse to participate in training, or attempt to run away. These boys were made examples of, subjected to public humiliation and severe punishment before being expelled from the program. Their fate was worse than death. They would live the rest of their lives as marked failures, denied the basic rights of Spartan citizenship. But most boys adapted, and this adaptation was perhaps more horrifying than outright failure. They learned to embrace the brutality, to find satisfaction in the suffering of others, to measure their worth by their ability to inflict and endure pain. They became efficient at violence, skilled at deception, and expert at suppressing anything that might be considered human weakness. The boys who had entered the AGOGE as children were gradually becoming something else entirely. They were becoming weapons, tools designed for a single purpose: killing and dying for the Spartan state. The process was so thorough that by the time they reached adulthood, they would have forgotten what it felt like to be anything else. They would have become the perfect soldiers, but they would have lost their humanity in the process. And this was only the beginning. The real horrors of the AGOGE were yet to come. 2 years had passed since Lysander had been torn from his family, and the gentle boy who had once asked innocent questions about the world had been systematically destroyed. In his place stood a 9-year-old who had learned to inflict pain without flinching, to endure suffering without complaint, and to view kindness as a dangerous weakness that could get him killed. The AGOGE had done its work with surgical precision. Every natural human instinct had been identified and eliminated. Every soft emotion had been burned away through repetitive trauma. Every individual quirk of personality had been hammered flat until all that remained was a perfectly shaped tool of violence. But the worst was yet to come. The dormitory, where Lysander slept, had become a battlefield of psychological warfare. 20 boys crowded into a space meant for half that number, their bodies pressed together in a parody of intimacy that bred only contempt and suspicion. The older boys, those who had survived 3 or 4 years of training, ruled over the younger ones with the same casual brutality that had been used to break them. Sleep was a luxury that came in fragments. The boys were awakened at random intervals throughout the night for surprise inspections, forced exercises, or simply to ensure that they never felt truly rested. They learned to sleep with one eye open, to remain alert even in their dreams, to view unconsciousness as a dangerous vulnerability that enemies could exploit. The thin blankets they were given provided little warmth, and the rushes that served as their bedding were changed infrequently and often crawled with insects. The boys learned to ignore the bites and stings, to accept discomfort as their natural state. Some developed infections from the insect bites, but medical care was minimal and often withheld as a test of their ability to endure pain. Food continued to be a weapon of control. The single daily meal of black broth, stale bread, and moldy cheese was calculated to provide just enough nutrition to prevent death while maintaining constant hunger. The boys became obsessed with food, thinking about it constantly, dreaming about it, willing to do almost anything for an extra scrap of bread or a piece of fruit. The theft of food was not just encouraged but required. Boys who didn't steal were seen as lacking initiative and were punished accordingly, but those who were caught stealing were punished even more severely, creating a system where success required not just criminality, but exceptional skill at criminality. The boys learned to move silently, to plan elaborate schemes to betray their friends for the chance at a stolen meal. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological torture that formed the core of their education. The instructors had developed techniques for breaking down human personality that were sophisticated in their cruelty. They understood that the most effective way to control someone was to destroy their sense of self, to make them doubt their own perceptions and judgment. One common technique was the use of contradictory commands. A boy would be told to do something, then punished for doing it. He would be praised for an action one day, then beaten for the same action the next. This created a constant state of uncertainty and anxiety, where the boys could never be sure what was expected of them. They learned to second-guess themselves constantly, to defer to authority even when that authority was clearly wrong. The instructors also used isolation and group punishment to break down individual identity. If one boy made a mistake, the entire group would be punished. This created an environment where the boys policed each other mercilessly, where any individual action was seen as a threat to group survival. They learned to suppress their own desires and impulses, to think of themselves only as components of a larger machine. The training itself was designed to push the boys beyond their physical and emotional limits. They were forced to fight each other with weapons, often sustaining serious injuries that were left untreated. They were made to run long distances carrying heavy loads, to climb obstacles while exhausted, to perform complex maneuvers while under attack. Those who couldn't keep up were beaten and forced to continue anyway. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the training was the way it normalized violence. The boys were taught that inflicting pain was not only acceptable but necessary. They were rewarded for hurting others, praised for showing no mercy, encouraged to view compassion as a character flaw. They participated in exercises where they were required to torture captured enemies, to execute prisoners, to commit acts that would have been considered war crimes in any civilized society. The older boys, those who had survived several years of this treatment, became the most effective instruments of brutalization. They had internalized the system so completely that they could no longer remember what it felt like to be gentle. They competed with each other to see who could be the most cruel, who could inflict the most pain, who could break the younger boys most effectively. Lysander watched boys who had been his friends transform into monsters. Children who had once shown kindness to animals now tortured them for sport. Boys who had once been gentle and thoughtful now sought out opportunities to inflict pain on others. The transformation was so complete that they seemed to have become different people entirely, as if their original personalities had been surgically removed and replaced with something cold and mechanical. The psychological conditioning was reinforced through ritual and ceremony. The boys were required to participate in religious ceremonies that celebrated violence and death. They were taught to worship gods of war, to view killing as a sacred act, to believe that dying in battle was the highest honor a man could achieve. These beliefs were drilled into them through repetition and punishment, until they became unquestionable dogma. The boys were also taught to view outsiders with suspicion and contempt. Anyone who wasn't Spartan was inferior, weak, unworthy of respect or mercy. They were shown prisoners from other cities and encouraged to abuse them, to see them as less than human. This created a worldview where violence against outsiders was not just acceptable but mandatory, where showing mercy to enemies was tantamount to treason. As the years passed, the training became more extreme. The boys were forced to participate in mock battles where real weapons were used and serious injuries were common. They were subjected to psychological torture, where they were forced to watch friends being hurt and were forbidden from helping. They were made to participate in rituals where they had to prove their loyalty by betraying or harming someone they cared about. The constant stress and trauma began to take its toll. Some boys developed what would now be recognized as severe mental illness. They became paranoid, aggressive, unable to form normal relationships. Others simply shut down emotionally, becoming cold and mechanical in their responses to the world. A few broke completely, suffering nervous breakdowns that left them unable to function. But the system was designed to identify and eliminate these weaknesses. Boys who showed signs of mental instability were subjected to even harsher treatment, forced to undergo additional conditioning designed to break them down and rebuild them. Those who couldn't be fixed were expelled from the program and marked as failures for the rest of their lives. The most disturbing aspect of the AGOGE was how it turned natural human bonds into sources of vulnerability. The boys were taught that caring about others was dangerous, that emotional attachments made them weak. They were forced to watch friends being punished and were forbidden from showing sympathy or offering help. They learned to suppress their natural instincts for compassion and mutual aid, to view other people as potential threats rather than sources of support. The instructors were skilled at identifying and exploiting emotional attachments. If they noticed that two boys had become friends, they would be separated and forced to compete against each other. If a boy showed particular talent or promise, he would be singled out for special attention that was designed to isolate him from his peers. The message was clear. Individual achievement was less important than group conformity, and emotional bonds were luxuries that warriors could not afford. The boys learned to hide their true feelings, to present a facade of indifference even when they were suffering. They developed an ability to compartmentalize their emotions, to function effectively even when they were in psychological pain. This skill would serve them well in battle, but it also made them incapable of forming normal human relationships. The physical training continued to escalate in intensity and danger. By the time the boys reached their early teens, they were expected to engage in combat exercises that would have challenged adult soldiers. They were forced to fight with real weapons, to participate in mock battles, where injury was not just possible, but expected. They learned to ignore pain, to continue fighting even when seriously wounded, to view their own bodies as expendable resources in service of the state. The boys were also subjected to extreme environmental conditions as part of their conditioning. They were forced to march long distances in extreme heat or cold, to sleep outdoors in all weather, to go without water for extended periods. They learned to function effectively under conditions that would incapacitate normal people, to push their bodies beyond what should have been possible. But the most effective tool of control was the constant threat of expulsion. The boys knew that failure meant not just disappointment, but complete social rejection. They would be marked as inferiors for the rest of their lives, denied the basic rights of citizenship, unable to marry or hold property. This threat hung over them constantly, making them willing to endure any amount of suffering rather than risk being cast out. The system was so effective that the boys began to police themselves. They would turn in friends for showing weakness, report on each other for breaking rules, compete to see who could be the most loyal to the program. They learned to distrust their own instincts, to view their natural human emotions as enemies to be defeated. As Lysander approached his 12th birthday, he had become something that his 7-year-old self would not have recognized. The curious, gentle boy who had once shown kindness to animals and asked innocent questions about the world had been replaced by a calculating, efficient machine designed for violence. He could inflict pain without feeling guilt, endure suffering without showing emotion, and view other people as either tools to be used or obstacles to be eliminated. The transformation was so complete that he could barely remember what it had felt like to be a normal child. The memories of his early years seemed like stories from someone else's life, distant and unreal. He had been rebuilt from the ground up, every aspect of his personality carefully crafted to serve the needs of the Spartan state. But the AGOGE was not finished with him yet. The worst trials were still to come. Tests that would push him beyond the limits of human endurance and force him to commit acts that would strip away the last remnants of his humanity. The boy who had survived the selection of the elders and endured years of brutal conditioning was about to face the ultimate test of his transformation from human being to weapon. The dormitory had become a place of constant tension and barely controlled violence. Sleep was no longer just difficult, it was dangerous. The boys had learned to sleep with their few possessions clutched tightly to their bodies, knowing that anything left unguarded would be stolen before dawn. They had developed an ability to remain alert even while unconscious, to wake instantly at the slightest sound or movement. The older boys, those who had survived 4 or 5 years of training, had become predators in their own right. They ruled the younger children with the same arbitrary cruelty that had been used to break them. They created elaborate hierarchies of dominance, where every boy knew exactly where he stood in the pecking order. Any challenge to this order was met with swift and brutal punishment. Lysander had learned to navigate this dangerous social landscape with the same calculating precision that he applied to everything else. He had identified the boys who posed the greatest threat, and the ones who might be useful as allies. He had learned to project strength even when he felt weak, to show aggression even when he wanted to show compassion. He had become an expert at reading the subtle signs of dominance and submission that governed their world. The food situation had become even more desperate. As the boys grew larger, and their caloric needs increased, the single daily meal of black broth and stale bread was now completely inadequate, leaving them in a constant state of near starvation. They had learned to eat things that would have disgusted them in their previous lives. Insects, scraps of food found in garbage, even grass and leaves when nothing else was available. The theft of food had evolved into a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The boys had developed elaborate schemes for breaking into storerooms, stealing from kitchens, and even raiding the food supplies of other groups. They had learned to move silently through the compound at night, to pick locks with improvised tools, to distract guards and slip past security. Those who were caught were punished with a brutality that left permanent scars, but the alternative was slow starvation. The constant hunger had changed them in fundamental ways. They had learned to think about food constantly, to plan their entire day around the possibility of finding something to eat. They had developed an ability to function effectively, even when severely malnourished, to ignore the weakness and dizziness that came with chronic hunger. They had learned to view food not as sustenance, but as a weapon, something that could be used to gain power over others. The physical training had escalated to levels that would have been considered torture in any other context. The boys were forced to fight each other with real weapons, sustaining injuries that often left permanent damage. They were made to run long distances while carrying heavy loads, to climb obstacles while being attacked, to perform complex maneuvers while exhausted and in pain. Those who couldn't keep up were beaten and forced to continue anyway, often collapsing from exhaustion or injury. But the psychological conditioning had become even more sophisticated and cruel. The instructors had developed techniques for breaking down the boys' remaining emotional defenses, for destroying the last traces of individual personality. They used isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation to create a state of complete dependence on the system. One particularly effective technique was the use of false hope. A boy would be praised for his performance, given special privileges, made to believe that he was succeeding in the program. Then, suddenly and without warning, all of these privileges would be stripped away, and he would be subjected to even harsher treatment. This created a state of constant uncertainty and anxiety, where the boys could never be sure what was expected of them or what would happen next. The instructors also used the boys' natural protective instincts against them. They would threaten to harm younger children unless the older boys complied with increasingly extreme demands. They would force boys to choose between their own safety and the safety of others, creating impossible moral dilemmas that left lasting psychological scars. They would reward boys for betraying their friends, for reporting on each other, for demonstrating loyalty to the system over loyalty to individuals. The boys were also subjected to what could only be described as psychological torture. They were forced to watch friends being punished and were forbidden from showing sympathy or offering help. They were made to participate in rituals where they had to prove their loyalty by harming someone they cared about. They were subjected to constant surveillance and encouraged to spy on each other, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust. As the boys entered their teenage years, the training took on a new dimension of horror. They were introduced to the concept of the Cryptia, a secret police force made up of the most promising young Spartans. The Cryptia was responsible for hunting down and killing helots, the slave population that formed the backbone of Spartan society. This was not just military training, it was systematic murder, designed to turn the boys into efficient killers who could take human life without hesitation or remorse. The introduction to the Cryptia began with theoretical instruction. The boys were taught that helots were not really human, that they were dangerous animals who posed a constant threat to Spartan society. They were shown examples of helot uprisings, and told that only constant vigilance and occasional massacres could keep the slave population under control. They were taught that killing helots was not murder but pest control, a necessary service to the state. The boys were then required to participate in increasingly violent exercises designed to desensitize them to the act of killing. They were forced to torture captured helots, to execute prisoners, to participate in mock battles where real deaths occurred. They were rewarded for showing no mercy, praised for their ability to inflict pain, encouraged to view compassion as a character flaw that could get them killed. The most promising boys were selected for special training in assassination and terror tactics. They were taught to move silently through the countryside, to kill without making noise, to spread fear among the helot population. They were given quotas of people to kill, and were rewarded for exceeding these targets. They were taught to view murder as a skill to be perfected, a craft that required constant practice and refinement. Lysander found himself selected for this special training, a recognition of his ability to suppress his natural human instincts and function as an efficient killer. He was taught to approach helot settlements at night, to identify targets, to kill quickly and silently. He was shown how to use various weapons, how to set traps, how to create terror through selective violence. The first time he was required to kill a helot, Lysander felt something inside him break. The man he murdered was a farmer, someone who had done nothing wrong except be born into slavery. As Lysander's knife slid between the man's ribs, he felt the last vestiges of his humanity drain away. He had become exactly what the system had designed him to be, a perfect killer, capable of taking human life without feeling guilt or remorse. The other boys in his group reacted differently to their first kills. Some vomited, others cried. A few refused to participate and were immediately expelled from the program. But most, like Lysander, simply accepted it as another part of their training. They had been so thoroughly conditioned that murder felt like a natural progression, just another skill to be mastered. Over the months that followed, the killing became routine. The boys would be sent out in small groups to hunt helots, to create terror in the slave population, to demonstrate the power of the Spartan state. They learned to take pride in their efficiency, to compete with each other to see who could kill the most people, who could create the most fear. They developed techniques for psychological warfare, for making their victims suffer before killing them, for sending messages that would spread terror throughout the helot community. The boys were also taught to view their own lives as expendable. They were told that dying for the state was the highest honor a Spartan could achieve, that survival was less important than loyalty. They were made to swear oaths promising to die rather than retreat, to kill themselves rather than be captured, to value the reputation of Sparta above their own lives. This conditioning was reinforced through ritual and ceremony. The boys participated in religious ceremonies that celebrated death in battle, that honored those who had died fighting for Sparta. They were taught to worship gods of war, to view killing as a sacred act, to believe that their highest purpose was to serve as instruments of state violence. The constant stress and trauma of their training had left lasting psychological damage. Many of the boys showed signs of what would now be recognized as severe mental illness. They had become paranoid, aggressive, unable to form normal relationships. They had developed an inability to feel empathy or compassion, to view other people as anything more than potential threats or targets. But the system was designed to identify and exploit these psychological changes. Boys who showed signs of mental instability were not treated or helped. They were pushed even further, their breakdown used as a tool for conditioning the others. Those who couldn't adapt were expelled from the program and marked as failures. Their suffering used as an example of what happened to those who couldn't meet the standards of Spartan society. The boys who survived this conditioning had become something that was no longer quite human. They had been transformed into perfect weapons, capable of inflicting death and suffering without hesitation or remorse. They had learned to suppress every natural human instinct, to view compassion as weakness, to find satisfaction only in violence and domination. As Lysander approached his 15th birthday, he had become everything the system had designed him to be. He was an efficient killer, capable of taking human life without feeling guilt. He was a perfect soldier, able to follow orders without question, and to function effectively under extreme conditions. He was a loyal servant of the state, willing to die for Sparta without hesitation. But he was no longer the boy who had been torn from his family 8 years earlier. That child had been systematically destroyed. Every trace of his original personality carefully eliminated. In his place stood a weapon, a tool designed for a single purpose: killing and dying in service of the Spartan state. The transformation was so complete that Lysander could barely remember what it had felt like to be human. The capacity for love, for joy, for simple human connection had been burned out of him through years of systematic abuse. He had become exactly what Sparta needed: a perfect warrior who could kill without conscience and die without regret. But the AGOGE was not finished with him yet. The final tests were still to come, trials that would complete his transformation from human being to weapon. And in the brutal world of ancient Sparta, those who survived to become full warriors would discover that even their hell-forged conditioning might not be enough to prepare them for the reality of their lives as adult Spartans. At 15 years old, Lysander had survived 8 years of systematic brutalization that had transformed him from a curious child into a coldly efficient killer. But his education in the art of state-sanctioned murder was about to reach its most horrifying crescendo. The Crypteia, Sparta's secret police force, had selected him for their most elite training program, one that would complete his transformation from human being to weapon. The Crypteia operated in the shadows of Spartan society, a network of young men whose job was to maintain control over the Helot population through terror and selective murder. These were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were assassins, spies, and torturers, whose very existence was officially denied even as their actions shaped the foundation of Spartan power. Lysander's selection for this program was both an honor and a death sentence. Those who joined the Crypteia were marked men, forever separated from normal society by the blood they would spill and the secrets they would carry. They could never return to civilian life, never form normal relationships, never find peace. They were trapped in a world of violence and paranoia that would eventually consume them. The training facility for the Crypteia was hidden in the mountains outside Sparta. a complex of caves and underground chambers where screams could not be heard and bodies could be disposed of without questions. The boys who were brought here were the most promising products of the AGOGE system. Those who had shown exceptional ability to kill without conscience and follow orders without question. The man who ran this facility was called Alcibiades, though that was certainly not his real name. He was a figure of whispered legend among the boys, a man who had supposedly killed more helots than any other Spartan in history. His face was a map of scars, his eyes the cold, dead gaze of someone who had seen too much death and inflicted too much pain. He looked at the new arrivals not as people, but as raw material to be shaped into instruments of terror. "You are no longer boys," he told them on their first day. "You are no longer even human. You are tools of the state, weapons to be used against its enemies. Your old names, your old identities, your old selves, all of that dies here. What emerges will be something new, something necessary, something that decent people will fear and despise." The boys were given new names, not the heroic epithets they had dreamed of earning, but cold, functional designations that reflected their new role as instruments of state violence. Lysander became Thanatos, the name of the god of death. Others were given names like Phobos, fear, Demos, terror, and Lycos, wolf. These names were not honors but brands, marking them as something other than human. The physical conditions in the Cryptea facility made the AGOGE look like a luxury resort. The boys were housed in underground chambers that were barely large enough to lie down in. They were fed even less than they had been in the AGOGE, often going days without food. They were subjected to extreme temperatures, both hot and cold, as part of their conditioning. They learned to function effectively while in constant physical discomfort. But the real horror of the Cryptea training was psychological. The boys were systematically broken down and rebuilt as sociopaths, their capacity for empathy and moral reasoning carefully destroyed. They were forced to participate in exercises that would have been considered torture in any civilized society, not as victims but as perpetrators. The first phase of training involved what the instructors called target practice. The boys were brought prisoners, helots who had been captured for various alleged crimes against the state. These prisoners were not given trials or even told what they were accused of. They were simply presented to the trainees as objects to be used for practice in the art of killing. The boys were taught various methods of murder, from quick and efficient techniques designed for assassination to slow, painful methods intended to extract information or create terror. They were shown how to use knives, garrotes, poison, and then bare hands. They were taught to kill silently, to dispose of bodies without leaving evidence, to create fear through selective violence. Lysander's first official kill as a member of the Cryptea was a middle-aged helot woman who had been accused of stealing food from her master's storehouse. She was brought to him bound and gagged, her eyes wide with terror as she realized what was about to happen. Alcibiades stood behind him, offering quiet instruction as Lysander positioned his knife. "Remember," the instructor said, "this is not murder. This is pest control. These creatures are not human. They are animals that threaten the stability of our society. You are performing a necessary service to the state." As the knife slid between the woman's ribs, Lysander felt something inside him die. It was not guilt or remorse. Those emotions had been beaten out of him years ago. It was the last vestige of his humanity, the final spark of whatever had made him a person rather than a thing. When the woman's body went limp, he felt only a cold satisfaction at having performed his task efficiently. The instructors praised his work, noting his steady hand and calm demeanor. They told him that he had shown promise, that he might one day become one of the elite killers who hunted the most dangerous enemies of the state. To them, This was the highest compliment they could give. To Lysander, it was simply confirmation of what he had already known, that he was no longer human. The training continued with increasingly complex scenarios. The boys were taught to infiltrate Helot communities, to identify potential troublemakers, to create networks of informants and collaborators. They learned to spread disinformation, to create suspicion and paranoia among the slave population, to use psychological warfare as effectively as physical violence. They were also taught to hunt specific targets, to track individuals across the countryside, to kill without being seen or caught. They learned to move silently through the darkness, to climb walls and pick locks, to disguise themselves as merchants or travelers. They became experts in the art of assassination, capable of killing anyone, anywhere, at any time. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their training was the way it normalized atrocity. The boys were not just taught to kill, they were taught to enjoy it. They were encouraged to compete with each other to see who could kill the most people, who could create the most fear, who could devise the most creative methods of murder. They were rewarded for showing enthusiasm for their work, for taking pride in their efficiency as killers. The boys were also taught to view their own suffering as a source of strength. They were subjected to torture, not as punishment but as conditioning. They were burned, cut, beaten, and broken in ways that would have killed normal people. They were taught to endure pain without showing weakness, to function effectively even while being tortured, to view their own bodies as expendable resources. This conditioning served multiple purposes. It prepared them for the possibility of capture and interrogation, teaching them to resist questioning and to die rather than reveal state secrets. It also reinforced their sense of separation from normal humanity, making them feel that they were somehow different from and superior to ordinary people who could not endure such treatment. The boys were also taught to trust no one, not even each other. They were encouraged to spy on their fellow trainees, to report any sign of weakness or disloyalty. They were rotated between different groups to prevent them from forming close relationships. They were taught that emotional attachments were vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. As the months passed, the boys were sent on increasingly dangerous missions. They were ordered to infiltrate Helot communities and assassinate specific targets. They were tasked with creating terror through random violence, killing people simply to send a message to the slave population. They were ordered to hunt down escaped slaves and bring back their heads as proof of their success. These missions were not just training exercises. They were real operations with real consequences. The boys were killing actual people, destroying families, creating genuine terror among the Helot population. They were not playing at being soldiers or practicing for future wars. They were engaged in active genocide, systematically murdering members of the slave population to maintain Spartan control. Lysander excelled at this work in ways that disturbed even his instructors. He showed an aptitude for killing that went beyond mere competence. He seemed to have a natural talent for violence that made him extraordinarily effective. He could track targets across difficult terrain, kill silently and efficiently, and disappear without leaving evidence. He became known among the instructors as one of the most promising killers they had ever trained. But success in the Cryptia came with a price that went beyond physical danger. The boys were becoming something that was no longer quite human. They had lost the capacity for normal emotion, for genuine human connection, for anything that might be called happiness or joy. They had become living weapons, tools designed for a single purpose, killing in service of the state. The psychological toll of this existence was enormous. Many of the boys showed signs of severe mental illness, becoming paranoid, aggressive, unable to function in normal social situations. Some became addicted to violence, unable to feel satisfaction except when inflicting pain on others. Others simply shut down emotionally, becoming cold and mechanical in their interactions with the world. The instructors viewed these psychological changes not as problems to be addressed, but as signs of successful conditioning. They wanted boys who were incapable of normal human emotion, who could kill without hesitation or remorse, who would follow orders without question. The psychological damage was not an unfortunate side effect. It was the intended result. As the boys approached their 18th birthday, they faced the final test of their training. They were required to return to their home communities and kill someone they had known in their previous life. A friend, a neighbor, even a family member. This was designed to sever their last connections to their former humanity, to prove that they were completely loyal to the state above all other considerations. Lysander was ordered to kill his younger brother, a boy who had been born after he had been taken to the AGOGE. The brother was now 7 years old, the same age Lysander had been when he is torn from his family. The boy was innocent, guilty of nothing except being related to someone who had been selected for the crypteia. The killing was to be carried out in a specific way, designed to send a message to the community about the power of the state. Lysander was to enter his family's home at night, kill the boy silently, and leave the body arranged in a way that would make it clear that this was not a random crime but a deliberate act of state violence. As Lysander approached his childhood home, he felt nothing. The house where he had spent the first 7 years of his life might as well have been a stranger's dwelling. The family that had raised him were now just targets, no different from the countless helots he had killed in the mountains. He had been so thoroughly conditioned that he could not even remember what it had felt like to love these people. He entered the house through a window, moving silently through rooms that had once been familiar but now seemed alien. He found his brother sleeping in the same corner where he had once slept, curled up on a thin mat with a threadbare blanket. The boy looked peaceful, innocent, completely unaware of the danger that stood over him. Lysander positioned his knife, preparing to complete the final stage of his transformation from human being to weapon. The kill would be quick and silent. Just another entry in the long list of murders he had committed in service of the state. The boy would die without ever knowing why. Another casualty in the endless war between the Spartan elite and anyone who might threaten their power. As the blade descended, Lysander felt the last vestige of his humanity die. He was no longer a person in any meaningful sense. He was a tool, a weapon, a thing designed for killing. The boy who had once asked innocent questions about the world was gone forever, replaced by something cold and efficient and utterly without mercy. The crypteia had completed its work. Another perfect killer had been created. Another weapon forged in the fires of systematic brutalization. And in the morning, when the body was discovered, the community would receive another reminder of the price of challenging Spartan authority. But this was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a life that would be defined by violence, paranoia, and the gradual realization that the system that had created him was ultimately unsustainable. The boys who survived the crypteia would discover that even their hell-forged conditioning might not be enough to prepare them for the reality of their lives as adult Spartan. At 18 years old, Lysander had completed his transformation from human being to weapon. The crypteia had done its work with surgical precision, creating a perfect killer who could take human life without hesitation and follow orders without question. But now came the most crushing revelation of his existence. Life as a full Spartan warrior was not the glorious reward he had been promised, but rather a different kind of hell entirely. The ceremony that marked his transition from trainee to full warrior was held at dawn on the training grounds where he had spent so many years learning to inflict and endure pain. The other survivors of his age group stood beside him, their faces showing the same cold indifference that had been beaten into them through years of systematic brutalization. They were no longer the curious children who had been torn from their families 11 years earlier. They were living weapons, tools designed for a single purpose. Alcibiades, the scarred instructor who had overseen their final conditioning, stood before them with what might have been pride if he had still been capable of normal human emotion. "You have survived what 90% of boys cannot survive," he told them. "You have been forged in fires that would consume lesser men. You are now full citizens of Sparta, warriors of the state, instruments of divine will." But even as he spoke these words of celebration, there was something hollow in his voice. A weariness that suggested he knew the truth about what these boys had become and what their lives would hold. They were not heroes or champions. They were broken men, psychologically damaged beyond repair, who would spend the rest of their lives trapped in a system that had created them but could never truly accept them. The ritual of initiation was simple but profound. Each young man was given a spear and shield, the tools of his new profession. They were told that these weapons were now more important than their own lives, that they must return with their shields or upon them. They were made to swear oaths promising to die rather than retreat, to kill themselves rather than be captured, to value the reputation of Sparta above their own survival. As Lysander took his weapons, he felt the weight of more than just bronze and wood. He was accepting the burden of a life that would be defined by violence, paranoia, and the gradual realization that the system he served was built on foundations of cruelty and fear. The boy who had once dreamed of becoming a hero was gone, replaced by something that would never know peace or happiness. The newly initiated warriors were assigned to different units and sent to various parts of the Spartan territories. Lysander found himself posted to a garrison on the border with Messenia, where his primary job was to maintain control over the Helot population through fear and selective violence. It was the same work he had done as a member of the Crypteia, but now it was his permanent assignment, his life's work. The garrison was a grim place, a collection of stone buildings surrounded by walls and watchtowers. The men who lived there were all products of the same system that had created Lysander, warriors who had been broken down and rebuilt as instruments of state violence. They had survived the AGOGE, the Crypteia, and years of active service, but survival had come at a cost that was written in their faces and behavior. These men were not the noble warriors of legend. They were paranoid, aggressive, psychologically damaged individuals who had been so thoroughly conditioned that they could no longer function in normal society. They trusted no one, not even each other. They slept with weapons within reach, ate their food as if it might be poisoned, and viewed every interaction as a potential threat. The daily routine of garrison life was mind-numbing in its predictability. The warriors would wake before dawn, drill with weapons until their hands bled, patrol the surrounding territory looking for signs of Helot, unrest, and spend their evenings drinking and recounting stories of violence and death. There was no joy in their lives, no pleasure except the grim satisfaction of survival. The work itself was brutal and dehumanizing. The warriors were required to hunt down escaped Helots, to investigate reports of sedition, to carry out executions and beatings. They were the enforcers of a system that depended on terror to maintain order, and they were expected to be efficient and merciless in their application of violence. Lysander excelled at this work in ways that disturbed even his fellow warriors. He showed an aptitude for tracking and killing that went beyond mere competence. He seemed to have a natural talent for violence that made him extraordinarily Rafiki. He could find hidden Helots, extract information through torture, and kill without leaving evidence. He became known among his peers as one of the most effective killers in the garrison. But success in this environment came with a price that went beyond physical danger. The constant violence, the paranoia, the complete lack of normal human relationships All of it was taking a toll on the warriors that was visible in their behavior. They were becoming something that was no longer quite human, creatures of pure violence, who had lost the capacity for anything that might be called happiness or peace. The psychological isolation was perhaps the worst part of their existence. The warriors were forbidden from forming close relationships, from showing emotion, from expressing anything that might be considered weakness. They were surrounded by other men but were essentially alone, trapped in their own psychological armor, with no way to connect with another human being. The food situation was marginally better than it had been in the AGOGE, but the warriors were still kept in a state of chronic hunger. They were given enough to survive and function, but never enough to be truly satisfied. This kept them lean and aggressive, ready to fight at a moment's notice, but it also contributed to their psychological instability. The sleeping arrangements were designed to prevent the warriors from ever feeling truly safe or relaxed. They were housed in barracks where privacy was impossible and trust was dangerous. They slept with weapons within reach, knowing that any sign of weakness would be reported and punished. They learned to rest without truly sleeping, to remain alert even in their dreams. The warriors were also subjected to regular inspections and evaluations, designed to identify any sign of weakness or disloyalty. They were encouraged to spy on each other, to report any deviation from the expected behavior. They were rotated between different assignments to prevent them from forming close relationships or developing local loyalties. As the months passed, Lysander began to understand the true horror of his situation. He was trapped in a system that had created him but could never truly accept him. The skills that made him valuable as a warrior also made him dangerous to the state. He was too skilled at killing, too independent in his thinking, too aware of the system's weaknesses. The older warriors, those who had survived decades of this existence, were cautionary tales of what his future held. They were broken men, psychologically damaged beyond repair, who had lost the capacity for normal human emotion. They spoke in monotones, showed no interest in anything beyond their immediate survival, and seemed to exist in a state of perpetual emotional numbness. Some of the warriors dealt with their psychological trauma through violence, becoming addicted to the act of killing and unable to find satisfaction in anything else. Others simply shut down emotionally, becoming cold and mechanical in their interactions with the world. A few turned to alcohol or other substances, trying to numb the pain of their existence. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their lives was the way they had internalized the system's values. They genuinely believed that their suffering was necessary, that the brutality they inflicted on others was justified, that the system that had created them was the best possible way to organize society. They had been so thoroughly conditioned that they could no longer imagine any other way of life. The warriors were also expected to maintain the fiction that they were heroes, that their lives were glorious and fulfilling. They were required to participate in public ceremonies where they were celebrated as the defenders of Spartan civilization. They were expected to present themselves as noble warriors, to hide their psychological damage, to pretend that their lives were worth living. This constant performance was exhausting and demoralizing. The warriors had to maintain a facade of strength and confidence even when they were falling apart inside. They had to pretend to be proud of their service even when they knew they were nothing more than tools of oppression. They had to act like heroes even when they felt like monsters. The system also required them to recruit new victims, to participate in the process of breaking down the next generation of boys. They were expected to serve as instructors in the AGOGE, to pass on the techniques of brutalization that had been used on them. They were required to identify promising candidates for the Cryptia, to help create new killers who would carry on their work. This aspect of their duties was particularly disturbing because it forced them to participate in the perpetuation of the system that had destroyed them. They were not just victims of the Spartan way of life. They were also its instruments, actively working to create new victims who would suffer as they had suffered. As the years passed, Lysander began to see the cracks in the system that had created him. The Helot population was growing restless, tired of the constant oppression and random violence. Other Greek city-states were beginning to question Sparta's methods and to challenge its power. The warriors themselves were becoming less effective as their psychological damage made them less reliable. The system was unsustainable, built on foundations of cruelty and fear that could not last forever. The warriors were burning out, the Helots were becoming rebellious, and the other Greeks were growing tired of Spartan aggression. Something would have to give, and when it did, the collapse would be catastrophic. But even as he recognized these problems, Lysander was powerless to change anything. He was trapped in a system that had created him, bound by oaths and conditioning that made rebellion impossible. He was a perfect weapon, but weapons do not choose their targets. He could only follow orders, carry out his missions, and wait for the inevitable end. The warrior's burden was not just the weight of his weapons or the danger of his missions. It was the knowledge that he had been created to serve a system that was fundamentally evil, that his entire existence was built on the suffering of others, that he could never escape the hell that had been made for him. He was a hero in name only, a monster in reality, a broken man who had been transformed into something that was no longer quite human. And still, his story was not over. The worst was yet to come. At 25 years old, Lysander had served 7 years as a full Spartan warrior. His body a map of scars and his mind a fortress of calculated indifference. The boy who had once asked innocent questions about the world was now a man who could kill without hesitation and sleep soundly afterward. But the Spartan system had one final humiliation in store for him: marriage. In Sparta, marriage was not about love or companionship. It was about breeding, about producing the next generation of warriors for the state. The women of Sparta had been raised with the same ruthless efficiency as the men, trained from childhood to be physical specimens capable of bearing strong children. They were taught to value strength above all else, to despise weakness, and to view their reproductive capacity as their primary contribution to society. The woman chosen for Lysander was named Penthesilea, a 20-year-old who had been raised in the AGOGE system designed for girls. She was tall and muscular, with the kind of physical strength that came from years of athletic training and deliberate hardship. Her face was attractive in a harsh way, with strong features that spoke of good breeding and careful selection. But her eyes held the same cold indifference that marked all products of the Spartan system. The marriage ceremony was a brutal mockery of romantic love. There was no courtship, no gentle introduction, no opportunity for the bride and groom to get to know each other. Instead, Lysander was told to abduct Penthesilea from her family's home in the middle of the night, to carry her off like a prize of war. This ritual kidnapping was supposed to simulate the capture of enemy women, to reinforce the idea that marriage was another form of conquest. On the appointed night, Lysander approached the house where Penthesilea waited. She was dressed in men's clothing, her head shaved like a young boy's, in accordance with Spartan custom. The idea was to make the transition from the homosocial world of the AGOGE heterosexual marriage as easy as possible for warriors who had been trained to view women with suspicion and contempt. The abduction itself was carried out in silence. Lysander grabbed Penthesilea and carried her to a darkened room where they would consummate their marriage. There was no tenderness, no affection, no acknowledgement that this was supposed to be one of the most important moments of their lives. It was simply another duty to be performed, another service to the state. The consummation was brutal and mechanical. Both parties had been trained to suppress their emotions, to view physical intimacy as a purely functional activity designed to produce children. There was no pleasure, no connection, no human warmth. It was breeding, nothing more. Carried out with the same cold efficiency that marked everything else in Spartan society. Afterward, Lysander was expected to return to his barracks and resume his normal duties. In Sparta, married warriors were not allowed to live with their wives. They were permitted to visit them occasionally, under cover of darkness, for the purpose of procreation. But their primary loyalty was supposed to remain with their military unit, their brotherhood of warriors who had been forged in the same fires of systematic brutalization. The restrictions on married life were deliberately designed to prevent emotional bonds from forming between husband and wife. Lysander was allowed to visit Penthesilea only at night, and only for brief periods. He had to sneak to her house like a thief, avoiding the patrols that would punish him for being away from his barracks without permission. The visits were supposed to be secret, shameful, something to be hidden from his fellow warrior. During these clandestine meetings, Lysander and Penthesilea would couple with the same mechanical efficiency they brought to all their duties. There was no conversation, no sharing of thoughts or feelings, no attempt to build any kind of emotional connection. They were two products of the same system, equally damaged, equally incapable of normal human intimacy. Penthesilea had been raised to be as hard as the men. She had been trained in athletics, taught to fight, conditioned to suppress her emotions and view weakness with contempt. The gentle, nurturing qualities that might have been considered feminine virtues in other societies had been systematically beaten out of her. She was a breeding machine, nothing more, designed to produce strong children for the state. The Spartan women were taught to mock men who showed any sign of weakness or emotion. They were encouraged to reject suitors who were not sufficiently aggressive, to despise husbands who showed affection, to view tenderness as a character flaw. Penthesilea had internalized these values completely, becoming as cold and calculating as any warrior. When Lysander first attempted to show some small gesture of affection, touching her hand gently, speaking her name with something approaching warmth, she recoiled as if he had struck her. "Are you weak?" she asked, her voice filled with contempt. "Are you some pathetic creature who needs comfort from a woman?" The words cut through him like a blade, reinforcing the lesson that even the most basic human connections were forbidden in Spartan society. The pregnancy, when it came, was treated as a military campaign. Penthesilea was expected to remain physically active throughout, to continue her training and exercises, to treat her body as a weapon that happened to be carrying a child. She was given no special care, no extra food, no relief from her duties. The pregnancy was simply another job to be performed efficiently. When the child was born, a son, the same horrifying ritual began anew. The baby was taken from its mother within hours of birth and brought before the council of elders for inspection. Lysander stood in the same room where his own fate had been decided 25 years earlier, watching as old men examined his son with the same cold calculation they had once used on him. The infant was healthy and strong, passing the initial inspection. But even as Lysander felt a momentary surge of relief, he realized the full horror of what this meant. His son would be raised for 7 years as he had been, then torn from his family and subjected to the same systematic brutalization that had destroyed his own humanity. The cycle would continue. Another generation of children sacrificed to the machine of Spartan militarism. The naming ceremony was a farce. The child was given a name that emphasized martial virtues, Leonidas, after the famous king who had died at Thermopylae. But like all Spartan names, it was less an expression of individuality than a brand marking the child as property of the state. The boy would carry this name until he either died in training or earned the right to be called a full warrior. Lysander was expected to feel pride in his son's birth, to celebrate the addition of another potential warrior to Sparta's ranks. But as he looked at the infant, all he could feel was a deep, crushing sorrow. He knew exactly what lay ahead for this child. The same hell of conditioning and brutalization that had destroyed his own capacity for normal human emotion. The early years of the child's life were a constant reminder of Lysander's own lost humanity. He was allowed to see his son only occasionally, and even then he was forbidden from showing too much affection or interest. Spartan fathers were expected to be distant, to view their children as potential assets rather than objects of love. Any sign of paternal warmth was seen as weakness that could undermine the child's preparation for military service. During these brief visits, Lysander would watch his son playing with simple toys, asking innocent questions about the world, displaying the same curiosity and gentleness that he himself had once possessed. The child was still human, still capable of joy and wonder and love. But Lysander knew that all of these qualities would be systematically destroyed, that the laughing, curious boy would be transformed into something as cold and mechanical as himself. The most painful moments came when the child showed affection toward him. Young Leonidas would run to embrace his father, would ask why he couldn't live with them, would beg for stories and games and the simple pleasures of childhood. Lysander had to steel himself against these displays of love, to maintain the emotional distance that Spartan society demanded. He could not allow himself to love his son because love would make the inevitable separation unbearable. Penthesilea showed no such struggle. She had been so thoroughly conditioned that she seemed incapable of maternal feeling. She fed the child, kept him clean, and provided basic care. But she showed no warmth, no affection, no sign that she viewed him as anything more than a duty to be performed. She was already preparing herself for the day when he would be taken away, building walls around her heart to protect herself from the pain of separation. As the child grew older, Lysander began to see signs of the same intelligence and sensitivity that had once marked his own personality. The boy asked thoughtful questions, showed kindness to animals, displayed a natural sense of justice and fairness. These qualities filled Lysander with both pride and terror, knowing that they would be the first targets of the conditioning process. The other warriors in the garrison watched Lysander's interactions with his son with a mixture of amusement and contempt. They mocked him for any sign of paternal feeling, calling him weak and unmanly. They reminded him constantly that the child belonged to the state, not to him, that his role was to produce warriors, not to indulge in sentimental attachments. Some of the older warriors, those who had survived decades of service, shared their own experiences with fatherhood. They spoke of sons who had died in training, of children who had been broken by the system, of the necessity of emotional detachment in a world where caring about others was a luxury that warriors could not afford. Their stories were cautionary tales, warnings about the dangers of allowing human feeling to interfere with duty. The system was designed to prevent normal family bonds from forming. Children were raised to view the state as their true parent, to see their biological families as temporary arrangements that would be dissolved when they reached military age. Parents were taught to suppress their natural instincts to protect and nurture their children, to view love as a weakness that could undermine the child's preparation for service. This psychological conditioning was reinforced through ritual and ceremony. Parents were required to participate in events that celebrated the state's claim on their children, to express public approval when their sons were selected for military service. They were expected to show pride when their children were taken away, to view separation as an honor rather than a tragedy. The women of Sparta were particularly instrumental in maintaining this system. They were taught to shame men who showed weakness, to reject suitors who were not sufficiently aggressive, to view military service as the highest possible achievement. They were expected to send their sons to war with the famous words, "Come back with your shield or on it," meaning return victorious or dead, but never in defeat. But beneath the surface of this ritualized cruelty, Lysander could see the psychological damage that the system inflicted on everyone it touched. The women were as broken as the men, their capacity for normal human emotions systematically destroyed. They went through the motions of marriage and motherhood, but they were incapable of genuine love or affection. They were breeding machines, nothing more, designed to produce the next generation of warriors for the state. The marriages were loveless arrangements that produced children who would be raised without affection, trained without mercy, and sent to war without regard for their individual humanity. The system was self-perpetuating, creating new generations of psychologically damaged individuals who would carry on the traditions of brutality and emotional suppression. As his son's 7th birthday approached, Lysander found himself facing the same impossible choice that his own father had faced decades earlier. He could try to protect his child from the system, knowing that such protection would only delay the inevitable and might make the conditioning even more brutal. Or he could participate in the ritual of separation, handing his son over to the same forces that had destroyed his own humanity. The night before the ceremony, Lysander held his son for what he knew would be the last time. The child was still innocent, still capable of love and joy and wonder. But by tomorrow, the process of transformation would begin, and the laughing, curious boy would be replaced by something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. As he looked into his son's eyes, Lysander saw a reflection of his own lost childhood. A reminder of what he had been before the system had broken him down and rebuilt him as a weapon. He wanted to warn the child, to prepare him for what was coming, to offer some small comfort in the face of the horror that awaited. But he knew that such warnings would only make the separation more painful, the conditioning more brutal. Instead, he simply held the boy close, memorizing the feeling of small arms around his neck, the sound of innocent laughter, the warmth of unconditional love. These memories would have to sustain him through the years ahead, when his son would be transformed into something as cold and mechanical as himself. The marriage had been a mockery, the family a temporary arrangement designed to produce new warriors for the state. But for a brief moment, holding his son in his arms, Lysander remembered what it had felt like to be human, and that memory, fragile and painful as it was the only treasure he had left from a life dedicated to the service of a system that had systematically destroyed everything good and gentle in the human spirit. Tomorrow, the cycle would begin again. Another child would be fed to the machine of Spartan militarism. Another generation would be sacrificed to the demands of a state that valued strength above all else, and Lysander would be forced to watch, helpless and complicit, as his own son was transformed into the same kind of monster that he had become. At 35 years old, Lysander had spent nearly 3 decades serving a system that had systematically destroyed every aspect of his humanity. The curious child who had once asked innocent questions about the world was now a scarred veteran whose capacity for normal human emotion had been burned away by years of conditioning and violence. But the Spartan machine was not finished with him yet. The final act of his tragedy was about to unfold on the battlefields of the Peloponnesian War. The war had been raging for over a decade, pitting Sparta against Athens in a conflict that would ultimately destroy both civilizations. For the Spartan warriors, this war was both vindication and doom-proof that their brutal conditioning had created the most effective soldiers in the ancient world, but also evidence that their system was ultimately unsustainable. They were too efficient at killing, too dedicated to destruction, too incapable of building anything lasting or beautiful. Lysander's unit had been deployed to the siege of a small Athenian allied city whose name would be forgotten by history. The settlement had refused to surrender, choosing to endure a siege rather than submit to Spartan rule. For months, the warriors had surrounded the city, cutting off supplies and waiting for starvation to break the defenders' will. It was the kind of warfare that Spartans excelled at, patient, brutal, and utterly without mercy. The siege had dragged on longer than expected. The defenders had proven more resilient than anticipated, finding ways to stretch their supplies and maintain their resistance. The Spartan commanders were growing impatient, demanding results that would justify the resources being expended on this minor campaign. The pressure was building for a decisive assault that would end the siege quickly and brutally. As Lysander prepared his weapons for what might be the final battle, he found himself thinking about his son, now 14 years old, and deep in the AGOGE system. The boy had been transformed over the past 7 years, his natural curiosity and gentleness systematically beaten out of him. When Lysander had last seen him, during a brief visit to Sparta, the child had looked at him with the same cold indifference that marked all products of the system. The loving, innocent boy had been replaced by something harder and more dangerous. The thought of his son filled Lysander with something that might have been regret, if he had still been capable of such emotion. He had participated in the creation of another weapon, another tool of state violence, another victim of the system that had destroyed his own humanity. The cycle was continuing, another generation being sacrificed to the demands of a society that valued strength above all else. But such thoughts were dangerous, and Lysander pushed them away. Emotion was weakness, and weakness was not tolerated in Spartan society. He had been trained to suppress such feelings, to focus on his duty, to view his life as expendable in service of the state. The conditioning was so complete that he could barely remember what it had felt like to be capable of love or joy or hope. The order to attack came at dawn. The defenders had been weakened by months of siege, their walls damaged by constant assault, their supplies nearly exhausted. The Spartan commanders had decided that the time was right for a final, decisive assault that would end the siege and provide an example to other cities that might consider resistance. Lysander formed up with his unit, checking his weapons one final time. His spear was sharp, his shield solid, his sword ready for close combat. He had done this countless times before, had participated in dozens of fouls and sieges, had killed more men than he could count. But something felt different about this engagement, as if the weight of his entire life was pressing down on him. The assault began with a rain of arrows and javelins, designed to clear the walls of defenders and create openings for the infantry. Lysander watched as men fell from the battlements, their bodies twisted by the impact of bronze-tipped weapons. He felt nothing at the sight of their deaths. The capacity for empathy had been burned out of him long ago. The siege ladders went up next, long wooden constructions that allowed the attackers to scale the walls and engage the defenders in close combat. Lysander was among the first to climb, his scarred hands gripping the rungs as arrows whistled past his head. He had done this before, had learned to ignore the fear that would have paralyzed a normal person, had been trained to function effectively even in the face of probable death. At the top of the wall, he found himself face to face with a young defender, a boy who couldn't have been more than 16 years old. The youth was armed with a spear and shield, but his hands were shaking, his eyes wide with terror. He was clearly not a professional soldier, probably just a citizen who had been pressed into service to defend his home. For a moment, Lysander hesitated. The boy reminded him of his own son, of the child he had once been, of all the innocent lives that had been destroyed by the system he served. But the hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. His training took over, and he drove his spear into the boy's chest with practiced efficiency. The youth fell without a sound, his blood spreading across the stone wall. The battle for the walls was brief but brutal. The defenders, weakened by months of siege and facing professional soldiers, were quickly overwhelmed. Lysander and his unit fought their way along the battlements, killing anyone who stood in their way. There was no glory in it, no honor, just the mechanical application of violence that had been drilled into them for decades. When the walls were secured, the real horror began. The Spartan commanders had decided to make an example of the city, to show other potential rebels what happened to those who resisted Spartan rule. The order was given to kill every man, woman, and child in the settlement, to leave no one alive who might remember the city's defiance. Lysander had participated in massacres before, had learned to view such actions as necessary tools of statecraft. But as he moved through the streets of the conquered city, something inside him began to break. He saw children cowering in doorways, women pleading for mercy, old men who posed no threat to anyone. They were all to be killed, not because they were dangerous, but because their deaths would send a message to other cities. The slaughter was systematic and efficient. The Spartan warriors moved from house to house, killing everyone they found. They had been trained to suppress their natural human instincts, to view such actions as necessary duties rather than atrocities. They worked in silence, their faces showing no emotion, their movements precise and economical. But as Lysander entered one of the houses, he found himself confronting a scene that shattered something deep inside him. A woman was huddled in a corner, holding a baby that couldn't have been more than a few months old. She was young, probably not much older than his own wife, and her eyes showed the same terror that he had seen in his son's face years earlier. The woman looked up at him, and for a moment their eyes met. In that instant, Lysander saw not an enemy to be killed, but a human being, a person with hopes and dreams and fears, just like his own. The baby in her arms was innocent, guilty of nothing except being born in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were not threats to Sparta, not dangerous rebels, just people who wanted to live their lives in peace. The spear in his hand felt impossibly heavy. He had killed countless people, had learned to view such actions as necessary duties, had suppressed his natural human instincts so completely that he had forgotten what it felt like to hesitate. But now, faced with this woman and her child, he found himself unable to move. The conditioning was still there, the years of training and brutalization that had turned him into a weapon. But something deeper was stirring, some vestige of the humanity that had been buried under decades of systematic abuse. He could feel it fighting against the programming, struggling to reassert itself after years of suppression. The woman seemed to sense his hesitation. She didn't plead or beg, just continued to hold her baby close, her eyes never leaving his face. She was prepared to die, but she was also hoping, perhaps, that some spark of human decency might still exist in the warrior who stood before her. For a long moment, Lysander stood, frozen, caught between his conditioning and his humanity. The spear remained poised, ready to strike, but something held him back. He could hear the sounds of slaughter from other parts of the city, the screams of the dying, the crash of falling timber. His fellow warriors were carrying out their orders with mechanical efficiency, but he found himself unable to act. The moment stretched on, becoming an eternity of indecision. Lysander had never experienced anything like this before. The complete failure of his conditioning, the sudden reassertion of emotions he had thought were dead. He could feel tears forming in his eyes, the first he had shed since he was 7 years old. But the conditioning was too strong, the programming too complete. Even as his humanity struggled to reassert itself, the machine of his training ground forward. His arm moved almost without conscious thought, driving the spear into the woman's chest. She gasped once, her grip on the baby loosening. And then she was still. The baby began to cry, a sound that cut through Lysander like a blade. He looked down at the infant, still alive, still innocent, still capable of becoming something other than a weapon. For a moment, he considered sparing the child. But he knew that such mercy would be seen as weakness, that questions would be asked, that his loyalty would be doubted. The second strike was quick and efficient. The crying stopped and the house fell silent, except for the sound of Lysander's own breathing. He had done what was expected of him, had carried out his orders with the same mechanical precision that had been drilled into him for decades. But something inside him had broken, some final barrier that had held back the full horror of what he had become. The rest of the massacre passed in a blur. Lysander moved through the city like a man in a dream, killing without thought or feeling, his body functioning on autopilot while his mind struggled to process what had happened. He had committed countless atrocities over the years, had learned to view such actions as necessary duties. But something about this particular killing had shattered his psychological defenses. When the slaughter was complete, the city was silent, except for the crackling of fires and the distant sound of carrion birds. Every living thing had been killed, every building looted or burned. The Spartan warriors had done their job with their usual efficiency, creating a monument to their own brutality that would serve as a warning to other cities. But as Lysander looked around at the devastation, he felt something he had not experienced in decades: shame. The emotion was so foreign to him that he barely recognized it at first. He had been trained to suppress such feelings, to view them as weakness, to focus on duty rather than conscience. But the conditioning was cracking, and through the cracks his buried humanity was beginning to reassert itself. The march back to Sparta was a torment. Lysander found himself thinking about the woman and her baby, about the look in her eyes, about the sound of the infant's cry. He had killed countless people over the years, but these deaths haunted him in a way that the others had not. He began to question not just this particular action, but his entire life, the system that had created him, the society he had served so faithfully. The other warriors noticed his distraction, his lack of the usual satisfaction that followed a successful mission. They began to watch him with suspicion, to question his commitment, to wonder if he was becoming unreliable. In Spartan society, such doubts were dangerous, marking a warrior as potentially unfit for service. When they finally reached Sparta, Lysander found himself unable to settle back into his routine. The garrison life that had once seemed normal now felt oppressive and meaningless. The constant drilling, the endless preparation for war, the brutal discipline, all of it seemed suddenly pointless. A vast machine designed to create suffering without purpose. He began to drink more, to seek numbness in alcohol when his psychological defenses failed. He found himself unable to sleep, haunted by dreams of the woman and her baby, of his own son being trained to become a killer, of the endless cycle of violence that defined Spartan society. The conditioning that had sustained him for decades was breaking down, and he had no resources to cope with the emotions that were flooding back. The final crisis came when he was ordered to participate in the training of new recruits, to help break down the next generation of boys and rebuild them as weapons. As he looked at the young faces, he saw his own son, saw himself at that age, saw the curiosity and gentleness that would be systematically destroyed. He found himself unable to continue, unable to participate in the perpetuation of a system that had created so much suffering. The end came quickly. Lysander's superiors, recognizing that he had become unreliable, decided that he posed a threat to the system. He was quietly eliminated, his death recorded as a training accident, his body disposed of without ceremony. The system that had created him consumed him, as it eventually consumed all its products. But even in death, Lysander's story was not unique. He was one of countless men who had been broken by the Spartan system, who had been transformed from human beings into weapons and then discarded when they were no longer useful. The society that had created him would eventually collapse, destroyed by its own brutality and its inability to create anything lasting or beautiful. The boys who were being trained to replace him would face the same fate, caught in the same cycle of violence and cycle of violence and cycle of violence and psychological destruction. They would be torn from their families, brutalized into submission, trained to kill without conscience, and then used up and discarded when they were no longer useful to the state. The Spartan system was ultimately unsustainable, built on foundations of cruelty and fear that could not last forever. The warriors it produced were too damaged to function in normal society, too brutal to create lasting peace, too focused on destruction to build anything of value. They were perfect weapons, but weapons are tools, and tools are eventually broken and replaced. In the end, the story of Lysander was the story of Sparta itself, a society that had achieved military perfection at the cost of its own humanity, that had created the most effective soldiers in the ancient world by destroying everything that made life worth living. They had built a machine for producing killers, but they had forgotten that even the most perfect machine eventually breaks down, and when it does, it takes everything around it with it. The boy who had once asked innocent questions about the world had become a man who could no longer remember what it felt like to be human. The system had done its work with surgical precision, creating a perfect weapon that was ultimately too perfect for its own survival. And in the end, that weapon turned on itself, as all such weapons must, destroying the very thing it was created to protect.